Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Windward Institute's webinar, Language and Literacy, Acquisition, Disorder, and Equitable Practices for Bidialectal Speakers with Dr. Ryan Lee James. The Windward Institute is so happy to share this content with you and to have Dr. Lee James here with us this afternoon. Dr. Lee James is a speech language pathologist, researcher, and advocate. She currently serves as Chief Academic Officer and Director of the Rollins Center at the Atlanta Speech School and as ASHA's Vice President for SLP practices. Her inspiring vision is that one day all children will be liberated through language and literacy. Dr. Lee James, thank you for being here. We're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Alexis. It is really great to be here with y'all. I'm just organizing myself over here, getting all my screens together. Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me. As Alexis said, I'm Ryan Lee James. I currently serve as the Chief Academic Officer at the Atlanta Speech School. Our school serves children who are deaf and hard of hearing, children who have early speech and language delay or DLD, and children who have dyslexia. I also serve as the director of our Rollins Center and free online Cox campus. The Rollins Center is an organization that started over 20 years ago, and our vision for the Rollins Center is literacy and justice for all. We develop content for teachers and really all child-facing adults. We have content for public health providers or medical providers and folks in the public health field, really all focused on ensuring that children get access. So our model and our belief is that if child-facing adults have what they need, then in turn, children will get what they need. I'm a speech language pathologist by training. Again, Alexis mentioned that I currently serve as the Vice President of Speech Language Pathology Practices for the American Speech Language Hearing Association. And a researcher, have been really interested for many years in how children acquire language and all that goes into language acquisition, including when we recognize that a child is struggling to develop language and how that impacts later language learning, i.e. reading, writing, and spelling. So today we're going to be talking about this topic exactly. Specifically, though, we're going to be talking about this topic as it relates to children who speak more than one dialect. And based on my research and just the plethora of research that exists in the field, I've really chosen to kind of focus this conversation on child speakers of African American English. It's also sometimes called African American Vernacular English, or Black English. So moving to, gotta make sure I'm moving on both screens. Moving to our learning objectives. Our learning objectives for today are as follows. So first, we're gonna relish in the power of language. And there's so much to relish in when we think about what language affords us. And we're gonna break language down a little bit: oral language, written language. We're going to describe the literacy crisis from a public health perspective. We're not going to talk, I have including root causes, but we're not going to talk as much about root causes just simply because of time. But I have some slides included, and I think that you may be able to access them after this webinar. Also, to understand, another objective is to understand oral and written language as reciprocal processes, including how we acquire language and when language is impaired for some reason. We're also going to examine how non-standard dialects impact the development of reading, writing, and spelling, using African American English as a case in point. And finally, review strategies to apply in your service delivery to advance equitable practices, to advance equitable access to language and literacy for all children. So I mentioned that I'm a speech language pathologist, and I'm not sure how many speech language pathologists we have who are joining this webinar live. But I want to just start with the power of language. And the reason that I came to this work is because of the power of language. Really early on, I was very skilled at navigating my social context, navigating my community with language, not just my one community, but my communities, my school community, my home community, navigating language with different adults in my environment. And I was really aware of that. I feel like as a child, I was really meta and really understood how to leverage language for my benefit. Then later on in life, I decided to go to a performing arts high school and there even honed my love of language even more. But now, different than early childhood, where I was kind of in love with oral language, in high school, I fell in love with written language and the power of reading and the power of writing, the power of persuasive speech, the power of informative speech, and just how we can harness and leverage that power to be successful, to get our wants and needs met, and to be in connection in relationship with others. So, how do we harness the power of language in different ways, right? And this list can go on and on and on and on. It's generative. We can think about this in an infinite number of ways. But here are just a few that I'm offering today for this webinar. We harness the power of language to inform and be informed, similar to kind of what we're doing here. I'm doing a little bit of the informing. Those who are listening are being informed, but we can even think about this in a dialogue, right? For communication's sake. In that reciprocal nature of language. We can harness the power of language to create and imagine. We can harness the power of language to preserve our cultures and rich histories. We can harness the power of language to take the perspectives of others and demonstrate empathy. This is one of my favorite reasons, or one of my favorite ways to harness language, is really to take the perspective of another person, really try to think about why this person did what they did or why they think the way that they think. And then in turn, to be able to use those language skills, all of the skills, pragmatic skills, the skills that we all have around language form, content, and use, to then demonstrate empathy. Alternatively, so these are all kind of positive ways, if you will, to harness the power of language, but we can also think about ways that the power of language is harnessed to inflict harm or incite violence, to manipulate or mislead. Also, we can think about the power of language being used to create alternative realities. I think this is something we're seeing more and more and more in society as we're all inundated or being informed in some way from different forms of media. You find that there are all these different alternative realities and universes that folks are really creating for themselves or for others, really harnessing the power of language in that way. What I want to offer to you today, though, is that as powerful as language is, not all of us, not all of our citizens in society are getting a fair shake and getting that access to language. And so I'm starting here before we move into oral language, before we move into supporting students from different backgrounds. I want to start here and just talk a little bit about the public health crisis that our country is facing. And I talk about, I've started to talk about literacy or illiteracy more from this public health lens. So let's look at how a public health emergency is defined by the CDC. So the Center for Disease Control defines a public health emergency or a public health crisis as an event that can cause harm to a person's health or to the health of a community. These events can happen at any time, anywhere. And this is how the CDC is defining a public health emergency. We can also look at the next definition on the screen, or just a quote from Nelson and colleagues that says, public health emergencies are defined as much by their health consequences as they are by their precipitating events. And so a really good example of this can be a recent example that we've all seen, which are those wildfires that were happening in California. Now, those wildfires have been classified, right, as a public health emergency or a public health crisis. But we can also think about the cause of those wildfires, or one identified cause, which is climate change. And so we can also think about climate change as a public health crisis or as a public health emergency, giving an example of how a public health emergency can be defined by its precipitating events. Moving on. So we see that in general, public health emergency or public health crisis sort of has these four criteria: that the event impacts the region or the world, impacts community health and overall well-being, impacts the potential loss of life, or impacts our global economy. And if you know anything about the crisis that we're facing, you know that we have all these boxes checked. So starting with impacting regions or impacting all regions or the world. This is our most recent National Assessment of Education Progress data. We can see this data from 1992 on up, that we have roughly 31% in 2024. This data just came out a few weeks ago, that roughly 31% of our nation's fourth graders are reading at or proficient. And you see that 69% are below that benchmark. And if you just take a gander at the data from 1992 on up, you can see how this has been a longstanding challenge for us for a while. This data remains relatively constant as we look across different states. I think the statistic recently was there are 38 states that have data that mirror the national trends. And so as we look on a whole, we can see that illiteracy is something that is impacting us across regions. Also, when we think about the community health and overall well-being, we know that folks who have grasped or attained a certain level of literacy tend to live longer than those who have not. We see stark differences in life expectancy. We see stark differences in health literacy. Health literacy is the ability to acquire, process, and appropriately act on information related to one's own health. Health literacy includes the capacity to process complex information and critically think in order to weigh options, right? So we can see how health literacy is inextricably tied to literacy. Let's keep going. We can also think about how literacy impacts our economy. The National Center on Education Statistics has an incredible adult literacy database. The acronym is, or the abbreviation is PIAAC. And if you just put that in your Google search, you will be brought to this wonderful database, a wealth of literacy data across states and even by counties. What we see nationally, what do we see? We see that roughly 54% of adults are categorized in our country at a level 1 or level 2. These levels, respectively, level 1, at risk for reading difficulties. Folks in level 1 may also be considered functionally illiterate. Level 2 is a level where adults are nearing proficiency, but more complex inferencing and evaluation may still be too difficult for them. And so you can see from the data nationally that we're seeing these disparities from early childhood or from early elementary. We can talk about early childhood, certainly, in terms of access, how it's just an ongoing sort of cascade. If you don't get the skills you need by fourth grade, what we see in the data and in the trends is that you're unlikely to get access to literacy later in life. Just a little bit more on literacy and the economy. A study by Gallup and the Barbara Bush Foundation estimated an additional 2.2 trillion in annual income for the United States, assuming that we can get all adults in our country to a level of proficiency. I also want to call out that states in the southern U.S. would stand to gain the most. And so really sharing all of this. Why? Because illiteracy or literacy is indeed a public health issue. It is a public health crisis. And it is incumbent upon all of us to take action. And so I know that that's why you're here today and are dedicated professionals in your field. Excuse me one second. I'm sorry about that. I'm having some real sinus issues recently. So let's take some time to dig into oral language. I mentioned that I'm a speech language pathologist. We know that oral language specifically, we think about listening and speaking, but we're also going to talk about reading and writing in this section as well. But let's just start by the simple question, what is language? What is language? We know that language is generative, meaning you can really create an infinite combination, an infinite amount of sentences, for example. Language is really generative in that way. Language is a symbol system, really, at its core. We can think about the language of math, for example, and think about the language that the math symbols convey. Language, we know, is oral and it's written, listening and speaking, reading, writing, and spelling. We know that language is rule governed. This is one of my favorite realizations and truths about language, is that it is rule governed. The reason why I love that is because if our oral language is rule governed and our written language is rule governed, this means that children really have an opportunity to learn and master that language system because it is rule governed. And so it's really about how can we support kids in learning the rules of language. We know that language is ever evolving. I have a 9-year-old, and some of the language that she uses with her friends, I'm like, wow, okay, that's interesting. Haven't heard that before. And my parents, right, would say the same thing about me, that over time, language sort of evolves. The words we use, how we talk about things, and the words we use to describe things and instances changes over time. We also know that language is nonverbal. Well, I won't go any deeper than that. I'll just say language can also be nonverbal. I'm including this schematic from Bloom and Leahy, 1989. This schematic, this framework for communicative competence, form, content, and use is really a seminal framework in the field of communication sciences and disorders, in the field of speech and language. It really serves to drive the work and underpin our understanding of how communication, speech, and language develop and how they're interrelated. What does it mean to be communicatively competent? What does it mean to be a real skilled and adept language user? Well, let's break it down a little bit. So language form refers to language, the structure of language, phonology, morphology, syntax. When you think about the sounds that govern words, pronunciation, how sounds can be combined, the phonotactic rules of a language to create words, morphology, how word parts, and of course those word parts carry meaning, how those are combined to create words. And then syntax, how syntax includes the rules that govern how we can combine sentences, phrases, and so forth. I'm raising this and reviewing this because as we think about children who come to us multilingual or bidialectal, they too are speaking a rule governed version of a system. It may be rules, the rules may fundamentally differ from my system or your system, but I want to impart that all languages and dialects are rule governed and will follow a set of essentially constraints and rules. Language content refers to language meaning. So, semantics, the meanings of individual words, the meanings of individual phrases, and then, of course, use or pragmatics. This really is all about social language, how we use language in context, and how the social kind of rules that govern how we engage in discourse. I'm going to keep going. So, how does oral language develop? Well, we know that babies are born seeking connection through communication. We hear a lot of talk nowadays as we're all inundated with the science of reading that babies or all of us are neurobiologically wired for or for communication. We know that oral language develops in context through interactions in the environment with caregivers and others. So, thinking about those rules of language. Children are learning those rules of language just by being participants in their everyday environment, right? Oral language is developing, it's dynamic. The process, we can see it happening. If any of you have spent time with little ones, you can see the process of oral language happening as children are making sense of their world through play, as they are using first words and sentences, we can observe how that language process or how that language development is taking place. Most children develop language without difficulty. Again, we know that. I have a 3-year-old right now. She is a very skilled language user. She's got appropriate syntax for her language system. And she's already learned, right, just by being in an environment where language is spoken, that in English, our word order is subject, verb, object. I have not explicitly taught that to her. Hey, Camille, subject, verb, object in English. Nope. In fact, she has learned that just by being immersed in an environment where we are constantly and consistently using language. Children with so there are children who learn language without difficulty, and there are a percentage of children who will struggle to learn language. I have the statistic here, the most recent prevalent statistic that I could find from the American Speech Language Hearing Association. Roughly 7.5% of children in the population will have DLD. Children with developmental language disorders will have difficulty with listening and speaking and connecting language to meaning. This difficulty in oral language may also manifest later in life as difficulty with reading, writing, and spelling. We also know by 5 years old, children produce most consonant sounds accurately and they're roughly intelligible about 75% of the time. That just means we can understand what they're saying about 75% of the time. We know that by 5 years old, children are engaging in complex pretend play. They have mastered many of the grammatical morphemes and some of the derivational morphemes. We know that by this age, children understand multi-step directions by around age 5 and can tell a story with beginning, middle, and end. Why am I raising all this, or why am I reviewing all this? Because children enter formal schooling with sophisticated and functional language systems sufficient for meeting their needs at home and in the community. This is should be, hopefully, to some of us, it's also for me a constant reminder as I think about how language develops for typically developing children, that children are coming to us with a functional language system. And in many cases, that language system is sophisticated. If they don't have DLD, if they don't have another developmental disorder, they understand the social cues of language already. They understand how to negotiate social context using language. They understand how to use language to get their wants and needs met. Overall, by and large, right? They're successful language users in their community. So this is just a good reminder as we think about approaching our students from a strengths-based lens. Now, thinking about written language, how does written language develop? Development of reading, writing, and spelling depends greatly on children's oral language skills. We know from research now that most children are going to require explicit teaching of the different components of language if they are going to become skilled and proficient, or skilled, proficient, and beyond, right? We understand now that there are some children who will just pick it up kind of by osmosis. Most children, though, majority of the children in our society, not just children who are coming from economically disadvantaged circumstances or children who are multilingual or bidialectal, majority of children will benefit from explicit and systematic instruction, which is why when you'll find later on in our presentation or in this presentation, at least I haven't really seen or am not recommending that something different than structured literacy be done with our multilingual learners or our children who are bidialectal. Instead, it's about how are we tooling ourselves up with the cultural humility, cultural responsiveness in order to really affirm their language practices, and then leverage them to support learning the academic language. Oral and written language instruction should occur in tandem and not siloed. We know this, right? We know that phonics and decoding are access points, but oral language, vocabulary, these are critical for comprehension. I should have even included those executive function skills that are really critical for deep comprehension. Adloff and colleagues has helped us understand recently through her work, 54% of children in her study with DLD also had dyslexia. And so we certainly see the co-occurrence there, underscoring the real importance of early identification in early intervention. So I'm including these systems here. We talked about the oral systems. I'm including these systems here because they are relevant for reading, writing, and spelling. I won't read all of these. I pulled this information primarily from the speech to print text. Louisa Moats has a wonderful table. It's actually table 1.1 in her text that just really does an incredible job of connecting, just through definition, how oral language serves or supports, makes that bridge and connection from oral to written through these different systems. Orthography, our written system of spelling, all the way down through pragmatics. And I would say, just considering the definitions that I've shared so far, we have not yet really talked about orthography. We're going to talk a little bit about reading and writing and spelling a little later, not too much later, because I only have 29 minutes. Woo! And I feel like I'm talking fast. But this is terminology, language systems to be familiar with. The big takeaway is, how are these different language systems, oral and written, impacted by a child's dialect use? Are they impacted? If so, how are they impacted? Let's keep going. So you're just going to see me keep coming back to this form, content, use, because I really think this model of really thinking about this integration of these different systems of language has to live beyond the speech and language world and into the education world, where our teachers and our folks, who are in front of classrooms every day, they are impacting or have the potential to impact literacy at the population level. Speech language pathologists like myself, we're really used to working in a one-on-one or small group context with children who have been identified. And so this information, again, around form, content, and use, really needs to live in the hands of teachers. So what is a dialect? We've gone from what's a language, what's oral language, what's written language. Now we're talking about what is a dialect. So dialects are variations of languages. Dialects often are oral, meaning that there is no written component or no written system, no formalized written system. Dialects are, well, and let me back up. That doesn't mean that dialect features can't show up in writing. They can, they will, and they do. For those of you who work with school age children, they do, but there's no formalized written system for dialect. Often, not always. Dialects are regional. In origin, we know that to be true. You can think about kind of that Boston dialect versus I'm down here in Atlanta. We can think about Southern dialects. Dialects are cultural. Dialects are tied to our identity, our histories, our culture. Dialects are functional language systems. I should have had this popping out big, right? Dialects are functional. They serve the purpose. They allow us to harness the power of language. They serve the purpose in our communities and in our homes. Dialects are rule governed. Again, they follow a set of rules. I'm going to give you an example of that in just 1 second. And dialects have distinct features in all language domains. So we're going to primarily be talking about language form, phonology, morphology, and syntax as we think about how African American English impacts reading and writing. But there's certainly distinctive features of African American English that we can categorize in these other domains. African American English is an oral system with a history as rich as its speakers. The American Speech Language Hearing Association in 1983 was really kind of one of those, really the first, I think, organization in our field to say that dialects are just a different system, but they serve a functional purpose. They're not a disorder. Doesn't mean that children who speak a dialect can't also have a language disorder. Indeed, they can. But this position statement by Asha was sort of groundbreaking for the field to say, okay, wait a second. So you mean to tell me that there's no right or wrong way to speak? And Asha said, yeah, that's exactly what we're saying. Now, of course, the sociolinguist who had been doing this research for a whole, 80 years before Asha even got in the game, the sociolinguists have been telling us forever and ever through their research, their qualitative analysis, that dialects are sophisticated language systems that serve a distinct purpose. And so I put this here again because as we reach kids, as we meet kids each day, we should really be thinking about ensuring that we're not suggesting through our words or through our actions that the way that they speak, also that the way that their family speaks and their community speaks, because remember how oral language develops. It develops in context. And so as a child, I learned language from my parents. I learned language from my community. And so when I come to school and you tell me that my language isn't sufficient, I can internalize that as you saying that my community or my home is not sufficient. And we know, again, when we look from a sociolinguistic lens or through linguistic analysis, that African American English specifically has been identified as a very sophisticated language system. So I'm going to keep going. So these are not complex sentences that I'm sharing here on the screen, but I'm sharing them because I want to just emphasize that African American English is a rule-governed language system, distinct features, phonology, morphology, and syntax. So take the three green sentences here, the first three. They is eating, they eating, they is, or omission of be, eaten. So these are just rule governed ways that a child who speaks African American English may produce or omit different grammatical morphemes. You can see, and some of the phonological features of African American English are pretty not necessarily distinct to African American English. We see this kind of in just general casual speech, that we're not always enunciating for the final ing. But these are just some characteristics of African American English demonstrating the rule governed nature. So you can look at this, the last sentence, he are eating. So sort of this swap is for are, that is a big no-go in African American English. If an African American child is producing this sentence, we would think, our first thought would be, maybe there's some difficulty with the development of morphology and syntax. We would not immediately jump to, this child is an African American English speaker, from hearing this utterance. Why? Because this utterance does not follow the rules of the dialect. I'm going to keep going. Oh, I included this. Even our social engagements in discourse are governed by rules. And this is for all of us, not just African American people, or not just bidialectal speakers or multilingual learners, or children from multilingual backgrounds. No, no, no. It is for all of us. Our social engagements in discourse are even governed by a set of rules. So this was a Tiny Desk performance on NPR. And I paused it when I was watching it and wanted to screenshot and share this because I think it's so fascinating. You can see the performer here, who's in the white, greeting another member of the community. He's identified this gentleman in the green as a member of the community. He claps his hand and brings them in for what this community would refer to as a dap. He gives them a dap. You look down here on the screen and you see the performer, again in white, extend his hand to another musician here who is dressed in all black. There's something about this interaction. He doesn't identify him. They don't identify each other, right? Because it's not just on the engagement isn't just on one person, in this case, the performer. It's two-sided. They don't identify at least the sharing the same set of social rules here. And so they extend for a handshake. And this is just one example when we think about how social pragmatics can show up even in the classroom. Okay, we know that dialect use occurs along a continuum from low to high. This is referred to as dialect density. How many dialect features, how prevalent dialect features are in your speech. And we know that dialect density is impacted by factors such as gender and age. Socioeconomic status tends to be the most consistent predictor of dialect density. Why are we interested in dialect density at all? Well, we're interested in dialect density for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons is because what research has sort of uncovered about the relationship between oral language and literacy and dialect density. So the more dialect features that a child uses in their speech, the more difficulty they may have on standardized measures of language, spelling, reading, and writing. We've also seen in a couple of studies that higher dialect density can be related to slower growth in literacy over time. Really hesitant about this factor because We also, there's more work to be done to really parse language ability from dialect. And so I put this here with realizing that this is what our current research tells us, and also understanding that more work is needed to help us really unpack this relationship. We know that dialect use can overlap with clinical indicators of impairment. So, and I'll have some more specific examples on the next slide, where some of the phonological features and some of the morphological or syntactic features of African American English, these features are also shared with many other dialects, Southern White English, Gullah Geechee, and many others, where we see these phonological features, for example, omission or zero marking of B, is, are, was, and were, as I demonstrated before, can, because of the rule governed nature of the dialect, those features can be omitted. It's totally legal, totally okay for the dialect. However, research also indicates that some of those dialect features are also hallmark indicators of language impairment. And so this is where the waters become muddied just a little bit. And if we think about what we know of children growing up in economically disadvantaged backgrounds, we can think about what their access to language has been. We're not talking about that today, but I put this up here on the screen because there's really this interconnected relationship between so many factors when we're trying to decide, okay, should we really be thinking about intervening on this, or is this just a typical pattern of the language? Okay, moving on. Uh-oh, I think I'm going backwards. Nope, here we go. Okay, so here's an example of some of the phonological feature overlap. Consonant cluster reduction. So for example, in the word mold, like I have mold growing on my bananas, we see that a feature, a hallmark feature of African American English is that consonant cluster reduction, where the child may say mole for mold. But we also see that in some cases, this is a clinic, or in many cases, this can also be characteristic of phonological difficulty in children with language impairment. And so including these here as some examples of how the dialect manifests in oral language, also realizing that these features, because oral language undergirds written language, that these features can show up in a child's reading or in a child's writing and in their spelling. Also realizing it's complex, also realizing that these features can be, in some instances, indicators of clinical impairment, language impairment. So let's just take an example here. We can go back, or we can go to another example of B, so zero copula, where in African American English, again, totally legitimate, totally rule governed to omit the copula here. So in general American English or standard English, we might say, "You are mad at Betty." And in African American English, it is totally permissible to say, "You mad at Betty," and omit that copula. Again, we would expect that some of these features would show up in writing. We also understand now that it's important to pay attention to these features. And thinking back on where I was mentioning difference versus disorder, we know now very clearly that children from all language backgrounds can and will, in some instances, have a language impairment. And so sometimes it becomes really trying to understand whether what our students are presenting with is typical versus impaired. Okay. Woo, my gosh. Gonna keep moving fast. So Toni Morrison says, it's terrible to think that a child with 5 different present tenses comes to school to be faced with books that are less than his own language, and to be told things about his language, which is him, that are sometimes permanently damaging. I wanted to include this from Toni Morrison because we know, not just from Toni Morrison, but from empirical evidence, that language and identity are inextricably tied. And so how we go into this work with students is really important. So I'm proposing a critical social contract that where leaders and educators must recognize and internalize that every child has exactly what they need when they arrive at school. Recognize and internalize that every child can achieve and be unwilling to accept failure as an option for any student. That we all must prioritize connection over compliance and reject policies that hyperregulate students and families. And we must hold ourselves to the highest standards of learning as evidenced by ongoing professional learning in content and in pedagogy. So now, okay, kind of getting into some of the how. I wish we had an hour and a half. I probably have slides to fill an hour and a half, but I'm going to move as quickly as I can. So thinking about cultural humility as a starting point for entering into this work with students. This graphic comes from Project Ready out of North UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I'm recommending that if you're not familiar with Project Ready, that you just type Project Ready into your Google search and download some of the resources that they have on their website. The whole focus of Project or the focus of Project Ready, I don't know about the whole focus, the focus of their work on cultural competence and cultural humility is to help educators move from this space of, okay, gaining cultural knowledge to moving to a place where I feel like I'm an agent of change and I recognize my own role in helping to reshape systems to better support students. So here's some questions that all of us can ask ourselves as we seek to further develop our cultural competence. Again, I'm really saying that this is kind of pre-work for even getting in front of students. Because again, remember, language and identity are inextricably tied. So I'm highlighting this question in red. This was a question that I kind of inserted here. Do you know what languages and dialects your children speak? It is likely that you are fully aware if they speak another language, but you may not know as much if they're speaking another dialect, right? And so this is a question to ask yourself. And then how can I learn? What are my resources for learning more about what languages and dialects my students speak? And then here are the questions that can support cultural humility. I'm going to keep moving in the interest of time. So once we move from our cultural humility journey, and of course, these things can happen in tandem. I'm going to keep pushing that I think that cultural humility work is critical for just getting us in the right headspace of being able to support students from a strengths-based lens. But after we do that, or simultaneously while we're doing that, right, we're in front of students every day. So as we start our work with students, we really should start with surveying language. And I'm using the term surveying language because I recognize that teachers, paraprofessionals, and others who are working with students in the classroom are not often speech language pathologists. And so it's not their job to diagnose or identify speech language impairment, but it is our job to survey the language of the children in our classrooms and in our care. Why? Because if we can identify or we think that there's a red flag, we can focus or help support that student in getting the early identification that they need. So I'm not going to read all of these, but here are some kind of some red flags, some things to be aware of as you're surveying students' language. Here's some general indicators of language difficulty, regardless of dialect. Here's a continued list. So weak concept knowledge, difficulty understanding multiple meanings. Again, another hallmark of children who are struggling with language. And so I'm proposing here that the next kind of step in this work is really to step back and survey the language of the children that you're responsible for. So let's move into thinking a little bit about language teaching. So a core goal of language teaching is for children to become metalinguistic and metacognitive. Notice that I am not saying a core goal of oral language teaching or a core goal of written language teaching. Again, I think that we should more start to talk about language as all encompassing, so that knowledge, that agency, and those skills can begin to reside more with teachers and with paraprofessionals who are responsible for supporting students every day. So metalinguistic is the ability to reflect on and manipulate language structure, function, and meaning in some way in your mind, kind of play with language, reflect on language and how it's being used. Metacognition is the ability to consider one's own thought processes, including self-awareness and self-monitoring. Just by definition, we can see how these skills are critical, for example, in reading comprehension. Implicit language knowledge develops through incidental language exposure. Implicit language knowledge is that unconscious automatic language knowledge. Like if I showed you a picture of a man on a farm with a rake and a hoe, and I said, this person is a farm, you would go, that person isn't a farm. He's a farmer. And you might not be able to draw on that that's a derivational morpheme, and derivational morphemes may or may not change mean. Like you wouldn't be able to reflect on all of that. This is just unconscious, automatic knowledge that you have about language. Implicit language knowledge is not necessarily being able to tell you about the structure or function of language, but again, it's implicit and you know it. And we see that children from a very young age, through grammaticality judgment studies, through phonological judgment studies, that very early on in development, as young as 3 years old, that children are demonstrating that real implicit knowledge of language. Explicit language knowledge develops through direct teaching of language. Children can tell you about the structure and function of language. And explicit language knowledge, what am I saying here? Early language supports literacy, and literacy in turn strengthens oral language. So that reciprocal process between early language and literacy. So some incidental language teaching strategies I have on these next couple of slides, and I'll go through these. These incidental language teaching strategies are good for all students. And so if you came to this webinar today and you were kind of thinking, I think she's going to give us some very specific strategies for working with African-American English speakers or working with bidialectal speakers, what I'm going to emphasize again is the responsiveness, the cultural humility, but the practices that we see that have been published in research are actually really can be done with intentionality, really supportive of students from various backgrounds. So incidental language teaching refers to interactions between adult and child that arise naturally in an unstructured or maybe even a semi-structured situation. So naturalistic techniques are used all the time by SLPs, but they can also be used intentionally in the classroom to support language development. So let's take a target, for example, of an abstract vocabulary word like grace, love, or hope. A naturalistic or incidental teaching strategy, incidental word learning, involves teaching words in contexts that arise during activities, instruction, or transition. So let's take this sentence, for example, from a text. Madeline gave him grace because she knew typo. Madeline gave him grace because she knew the real person. Oh, the real reason he was upset. Oh my God, I'm confusing myself with this typo. I'm sorry about that, y'all. Let me read that again. Madeline gave him grace because she knew. I'm sorry, I need to pause for 1 second. I'm throwing myself off, y'all. Give me 1 second. Okay, Madeline gave him grace because she knew the real person he was upset with. I'm going to go with that. So a teacher might say, grace in this case means to forgive or excuse. Tell me about a time when you showed grace to someone. So incidental word learning happening in context, happening in the environment, right? The teacher stops and pauses while she's reading the text, maybe observes, looking around the room. Does anybody know what the word grace means? Tell me about it, or then gives the definition. Grace in this case means to forgive or excuse. Tell me about a time when you showed grace to someone. Let's go to another example. So elaborated noun phrases. So something I want to emphasize in the language teaching is that it is incredibly intentional. How many teachers, maybe teachers who are in this webinar today, because y'all are, going above and beyond, your exemplars probably in your schools and in your communities. But how many teachers do we think actually go into a conversation or an engagement with students and think about, now, how am I going to teach elaborated noun phrases today? Right? Not really. Teachers are not usually thinking from this lens, but we know that supporting children and building up these language structures orally will then serve to support later language or later reading comprehension. So an elaborated noun phrase, a phrase that includes two or more modifiers, and serve to add precision and descriptiveness in discourse and writing. Precision and descriptiveness, two elements that become critical, right? As children begin crafting their own writing, and as they grow into more sophisticated language skills. So a naturalistic strategy to teach elaborated noun phrases, we can think about expansions, taking what a student says and adding semantic or syntactic information to it. So maybe the student says, Ramona was happy. And the teacher says, I agree with you. Ramona was a happy, fun kid, right? So we're elaborating that phrase. The take-home message here is we should be consistently and intentionally identifying language targets to develop students' oral language, which will then support their reading comprehension and writing. I've already said that oral and written language are reciprocal processes. So now we can think about direct language teaching. So we've thought about incidental language teaching. I know I'm moving kind of fast. Incidental language teaching, those everyday kind of opportunities that arise in an unstructured or semi-structured environment, let's not only just seize them, but let's be intentional about thinking about those language targets, like, for example, elaborated noun phrases. Direct language teaching is something that we're all much more familiar with, I'm sure, on this call, because many of us are inundated now with conversations on the science of reading. So I don't even have to read this. We probably all know it by heart, that the science of reading is a vast and interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research. Unfortunately, though, despite, Nicole Patton-Terry says, despite its promise, the science of reading is not yet, I would add yet, benefiting Black and Brown children at scale. Why is that? Oh my gosh, that's not what the topic of this webinar is today, but we can think about so many systemic reasons why the science of reading is not reaching children from all backgrounds at scale. What is direct language teaching? Explicit and systematic instruction. I've given it the header direct language teaching. It's explicit. The concepts are taught using direct teaching of the content or skill to be learned. It's systematic. The elements of the language are taught sequentially with intensive practice. It's cumulative. Lessons build on previous knowledge. They build on themselves. and it's diagnostic. In direct language teaching, we are intentionally in an ongoing fashion assessing the needs of the learners. We're not able to do our job if we are not consistently assessing the needs of learners. So here is an example that I'm using to sort of illustrate how explicit and systematic teaching can happen in a decoding and encoding lesson. Thinking if we're starting with, our phonemic awareness blending or the warm up, we're going to emphasize phonetics and pronunciation here. I would always say that we shouldn't make comments. We shouldn't make comments about, again, about students' language, comments like, or that could be interpreted in a negative way or impact their self-concept, like, well, that might be how you say it at home, but this is school. No, schools were meant to be extensions of communities. Students should be able to bring their whole selves to school. So really, we just want to kind of comment and provide students with explicit feedback, right? A core feature of explicit instruction. So we can think about targeting words that we know might be a challenge for African American English speakers in this case. Why might these words be a challenge in a spelling task? Well, because we've already said that orally, consonant clusters can be omitted. It's legal in African American English, it's permissible. So we might want to target these words in an exercise or in an activity with students to kind of not only build on their phonemic awareness, but also what are we doing when we compare these words? We're building on their meaning. Going back to the point that decoding and encoding and all of those skills should not take, or that instruction doesn't need to take place siloed, but can be integrated with meaning in language, deeper language. So continuing on with this example, we might ask the student, what's the word? Students, we can think about this in a small group. Students chorally repeat, cold. Okay, tap it out. We can get them to tap the word out, write it, spell it, and then what's the word? Have the student say it again. This dictation paper and this dictation routine is available on our Cox campus, which again, I can share in the chat. We can think about, again, the phonological feature, consonant cluster reduction, and using Elkonin boxes, getting multisensory, and really having students stop and be reflective on the language and their pronunciation, right? So again, we're not using words like that was, that was right, that was wrong, or you talk like that at home, or you don't talk like that at school. We're really trying to draw students' explicit attention to the phonemes. So something like, I heard you say coal. The word that I said was cold. Hear those sounds? Let's try to move one sound in each box, or let's move one chip in each box for every sound that we hear, and really ask students to slow down and reflect on their language. Again, going back to our earlier goal of becoming metacognitive, that and metalinguistic, that is the ultimate goal, to have students be able to stop and think about the task and think about the language knowledge that they need to then employ to bring to that task. This explicit teaching poster is also available on our Cox campus. And it is I think for many teachers that we work with, it has been really helpful because it just lays it out for you. Modeling, specific praise, corrective feedback, checking for understanding, scaffolding, and then one that is so critical, that's the anchor here at the bottom, intentional pacing. Intentional pacing, recognizing that, yep, I know my Hegarty curriculum says I'm supposed to be doing this, or I know my Foundations lesson plan is I'm supposed to be here on Tuesday, but I've got to slow down and I've got to go back and do more practice, more scaffolding with my students who are bringing different language abilities and different skills to the classroom. Okay, I promise I'm almost done, y'all. I'm going to end this presentation. So we talked about incidental teaching, we talked about direct teaching, and I'm going to end this presentation by talking about something that I think is incredibly critical for all of us, all of our teachers, all of our educators, regardless of what role you serve, superintendent, principal, literacy coach, IEP, SST, whatever team you're on at school, whatever your role is, I want to emphasize evidence-based practice. I'm just going to take the last few minutes. I know I'm over time, but I think this is really important, and this is going to close out my presentation. I want us to be thinking about evidence-based practice as a framework. What I learned crossing over into the education world from the speech and language world is that when I'm sitting alongside educators, often when they talk about evidence-based practice, they're talking about a set of practices. In the communication science and disorders world, when we talk about evidence-based practice, we're talking about a process, not a set of practices, but a process by which you employ your clinical acumen, your professional acumen to make the best possible decision for those students, for the people in your care. So for the American Speech Language Hearing Association, I've adopted this triangle from ASHA, but evidence-based practice in the field includes 3 components: internal and external evidence, family student perspectives, practitioner expertise and experience. We can break this down even further into critical appraisal of external evidence. So if we just think about how am I ensuring that I deliver on that social contract that I shared a few minutes ago? That social contract says that I'm going to hold myself to the highest standards in my field, higher than the standards in my field. How am I going to get there? The evidence-based practice framework says that those 3 sides of that triangle, let me go back real quick: internal and external evidence, family student perspectives, and practitioner expertise and experience is our vehicle for getting there. We have got to, as professionals, really learn how to critically appraise the evidence, because there's no one webinar, there's no one meeting that's going to give you all the practices, all the skills that you need. You've got, the collective, we have to learn how to critically appraise and evaluate the evidence in front of us. We also have to think, how am I analyzing the internal evidence that I have? Internal evidence refers to your student observations. If you're coaching teachers, it could be your teacher observations that then you link to the student observations. That internal data is the data that we're collecting from those that we serve to say, okay, wait a second, it's week 7 and Ryan is still really struggling with isolating phonemes. I've got to go back to that, but I can't just go back to it and do what my curriculum says. I've got to draw on what I've learned from the evidence, on those who are on the evidence based on students who are struggling to respond to phonemic awareness intervention in tier 1. So it's integrating the different forms of evidence. We've already talked about cultural humility. This is central to integrating those student and family perspectives, and then constantly updating our knowledge and our beliefs to continue to grow our professional acumen. I've already mentioned this, evidence-based practice in education is this sort of checklist of practices versus this dynamic process that really helps us critically evaluate evidence while also updating our own knowledge and beliefs. It's this cycle of constantly getting better as professionals to serve those in our care. And I just love this evidence-based practice as a framework for kind of just breaking through into the education space, because I think it disrupts our current thinking and helps us shift from compliance on, like, our state legislation, our curriculum, and really shifts us to being more transformative and relying on the professional acumen that all of us harness. So the what of EBP: internal and external evidence, family and student perspectives, practitioner expertise and experience; the how of EBP: critical appraisal, critical analysis, cultural humility, and constantly updating our own knowledge and beliefs. Here is my email address, rjames@atlantaspeechschool.org. If you have any thoughts, any questions, any wonderings, if you just want to get into a dialogue with me, I'd be delighted to talk with you, learn more about the work that you're doing, and share more about what we're doing here at the Rollins Center in the Atlanta Speech School. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you. That was so wonderful, Dr. Lee James.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I went over.
No, please.
I just
everything that went past the hour was pretty critical information. So
okay, great.
And we will be making the recording available to registrants. So if anyone needed to log off a little bit early, they can catch the content later.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here.
Bye, y'all. Thank you for joining. And I see that there are a couple questions in the Q&A. Just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to share some resources with you that we share with families. It's, again, rjames@atlantaspeechschool.org.
Thank you for joining us. For more information on future workshops, courses, and webinars, please visit our website at www.thewindwardschool.org/wi.